What would happen if you discovered that your brain, deprived of any social contact, not only deteriorates, but can develop extraordinary capacities of consciousness and neuroplasticity that remain hidden throughout a lifetime of constant interaction? Imagine if you knew that there is a silent laboratory within each of us, a neural space that only reveals itself when all external voices cease and the brain is finally forced to dialogue exclusively with itself. I'm not talking about loneliness as punishment or isolation as pathology. I'm talking about a revolutionary discovery that neuroscientists like Richard Davidson and Andrew Newberg have documented. The brain in voluntary isolation can develop permanent changes in neural networks linked to self-awareness, compassion, and emotional regulation that are impossible to achieve with constant social stimulation. Clarice Lispector intuitively knew what neuroscience now confirms. There is a hidden neural architecture that only emerges in absolute silence, when the brain stops being what others expect it to be and begins to discover what it truly is. She understood that solitude is not absence, but radical presence. When external noise ceases, the brain reveals its most primitive nature and, paradoxically, its most transcendent capacity for self-knowledge. The problem is that our culture has turned isolation into a terror and loneliness into a symptom, when in fact they can be the most powerful tools for neural transformation we possess. Today, I'm going to reveal what truly happens to your brain when it's deprived of social input, and why it can be both devastating and enlightening depending on the quality of awareness you bring to the experience. If you feel ready to discover the neural secrets of conscious solitude, comment below. My brain is my laboratory. Welcome to a glimpse of the real, where silence speaks and the soul finds itself. Today we'll explore, without any social contact, what happens to your brain. Have you ever gone days without talking to anyone and felt like you were losing the ability to form coherent thoughts? As if your mind were fragmenting in the absence of social mirrors that confirm your existence. This is the common experience of unchosen isolation, the panicked brain, desperate for external validation, deteriorating in the absence of constant social input. But here's the fundamental mistake everyone makes. We believe that loneliness is always pathological, that isolation is always destructive, that a brain deprived of social contact is automatically deteriorating. We try to cure loneliness with more socializing. We medicate introversion as if it were a disease. We avoid silence as if it were a symptom of depression. Why do they promise that more social connection will solve everything, but only deliver a growing dependence on external validation? Why doesn't anyone talk about brains that flourish in solitude, that develop extraordinary capacities when they can finally process experiences without the constant interference of social expectations? Because a fundamental piece of understanding is missing: the neural difference between imposed isolation and chosen solitude. The uncomfortable truth is that many treatments for socialization problems actually intensify neural dependence on external approval, preventing the brain from developing its natural capacity for self-regulation and self-awareness that only emerges in genuine silence. Dr. Richard Davidson, one of the pioneers of contemplative neuroscience, made a discovery that completely changed our understanding of isolation. The brains of meditators who spent years in solitary retreat show permanent changes in the neural networks linked to attention, compassion, and emotional self-regulation. They develop a fundamentally different brain architecture than those who live in constant social stimulation. Andrew Newberg discovered something even more extraordinary. Voluntary isolation can alter the activity of the temporal lobe and the default neural network, the same areas hyperactive in states of anxiety and depression. The brain in conscious solitude not only calms down, but develops new forms of processing that integrate information in ways impossible during social interaction. Clarice Lispector experienced this neural alchemy through literature. She knew that her isolated characters, G.H. Joanna, Maccabea, were not pathological studies, but explorations of cerebral potentialities that only emerge when the mind stops constantly reacting to external stimuli and begins to dialogue with deeper layers of consciousness. DRA. Lisa Miller discovered that brains that learn to navigate voluntary solitude develop greater resilience, creativity, and the ability to find meaning in experiences that others would consider empty or terrifying. They literally rebuild their neural networks to function more independently and integratively. Carl Jung would recognize in these scientific findings the confirmation of his intuition about the necessity of isolation for individuation, the process through which the brain becomes capable of functioning as an integrated whole, not just as a collection of conditioned social reflexes. If these neurological discoveries resonate with you, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to continue exploring the mysteries of isolated consciousness. What these pioneers of contemplative neuroscience discovered, and what I'll reveal to you today, is that there's a profound neural transformation that only occurs when the brain is deprived of social input for significant periods. It's not about resisting isolation, but about understanding how to consciously navigate it to develop extraordinary neural capabilities. This transformation is inevitable because the brain, deprived of external stimuli, is forced to reorganize its networks more efficiently and integratively. It is irreversible because the neuroplastic changes that occur during conscious isolation create new, permanent patterns of brain connectivity. And it is permanent because it develops a neural architecture capable of self-regulation independent of external validation. When you truly understand what happens to your brain without social contact, when you learn the difference between destructive isolation and transformative solitude, you gain access to dimensions of consciousness that remain completely hidden during constant social life. You discover that your brain possesses capacities for introspection, creativity, and transcendence that are only activated in absolute silence. If you recognize these possibilities as real, if something deep inside you has always known there's a hidden neural universe waiting to be explored, subscribe to the channel. Because what follows will completely change your understanding of loneliness, consciousness, and the human brain's potential. The human brain evolved as a deeply social organ, but when deprived of contact, it doesn't simply wither, it reorganizes itself in surprising and sometimes disturbing ways. Richard Davidson has documented that voluntary isolation can lead to changes in the default neural network, the same area that becomes hyperactive in depression and anxiety when isolation is imposed or experienced as rejection. Clarice intuitively knew what neuroscience now confirms. Loneliness forces the brain to create new patterns of self-connection. In characters like GH in The Passion According to GH, she captured how the mind, deprived of external stimuli, begins to dialogue with deeper layers of the psyche that normally remain silenced by constant social noise. Dr. Lisa Miller discovered something revolutionary. Isolation can be both devastating and enlightening depending on the quality of awareness brought to the experience. The brain in forced isolation goes into survival mode, producing excessive cortisol and deteriorating areas responsible for emotional regulation. But the brain in chosen solitude can develop greater activity in the prefrontal cortex, an area linked to self-awareness and higher emotional regulation. Jung would recognize in these findings the confirmation of his intuition about the need for retreat for individuation. The brain needs periods without social input to process and integrate experiences, to allow unconscious content to emerge without constant interference from social expectations. It is in neural silence that our true cognitive architecture can be consciously mapped and reorganized. Something extraordinary happens when the brain is deprived of external social connection for prolonged periods. It can develop a deeper connection with itself and, paradoxically, with broader dimensions of consciousness. Sam Harris documents how states of meditative isolation can lead to neural experiences where the boundaries of the individual's self dissolve, revealing patterns of brain connectivity normally inaccessible. Clarice captured this neural alchemy in characters who, in their deepest solitude, discovered a cosmic intimacy inexplicable by conventional neuroscience. It's as if the brain, unable to find the other in the external world, began to recognize the presence of others within itself, other layers of consciousness, other neural voices, other dimensions of processing that emerge only in absolute silence. Andrew Newberg has shown that meditators on long retreats develop greater activity in the insula, a brain region linked to empathy and compassion. Paradoxically, neural isolation can make brains more connected to universal humanity, not less. It's as if, by delving deeply into their own neural networks, they tap into patterns of connectivity that transcend individual limitations. Alan Watts would argue that this occurs because isolation forces us to recognize that we were never truly separate. The isolated brain can discover that separation is an illusion created by excessive social stimulation. In neural stillness, it can access patterns of consciousness that reveal fundamental interconnection with broader processes of existence. When the brain is deprived of social input for long periods, something fascinating and disturbing happens. It begins to create its own internal reality. Bruce Lipton has documented how extreme isolation can lead to both cognitive decline and states of extraordinary creativity, depending on how neural networks interpret and process the absence of external stimuli. Clarice was intimately familiar with this border zone, where neural sanity meets creative genius. Her characters in isolation often experience epiphanies that blur the line between genuine revelation and hallucinatory reorganization. The brain, desperate for stimulation, begins to generate its own internal narratives, its own neural dialogues, its own perceptual realities. Newberg discovered that prolonged states of solitude can dramatically alter the activity of the temporal lobe, an area associated with both transcendent creativity and mystical experiences, and, in extreme cases, psychotic episodes. It's a fine neural line between enlightenment and madness, and the isolated brain walks this neuroplastic tightrope without a social safety net. Sartre would recognize in this creative deterioration a manifestation of radical neural freedom. When all social structures are removed, the brain is forced to create its own patterns of meaning, its own processing rules, its own architecture of reality. This can be neurologically liberating or terrifying, depending on the neural courage to assume this absolute responsibility for one's own consciousness. There's a neuroplastic tipping point in isolation where the brain stops resisting loneliness and begins to thrive in it, as in its natural environment. Dr. Lisa Miller has identified that brains that learn to consciously navigate loneliness develop greater neural resilience, expanded creativity, and superior emotional self-regulation. Solitude ceases to be an experience of deprivation and becomes a laboratory for expanding consciousness. Clarice experienced this neural transformation in her own experience of creative isolation. There is a distinct quality to her late writing, a neural peace with solitude, an ability to find cognitive fulfillment in her own cerebral company. Her brain had learned the neuroplastic alchemy of transforming isolation into expanded intimacy with herself. Viktor Frankl would say that this transformation occurs when the brain discovers neurological meaning in the experience of loneliness. Neural networks that find purpose in isolation, whether for creation, contemplation, or deep self-knowledge, develop a fundamentally different architecture than those that experience loneliness as abandonment or social punishment. Jung would recognize this neural rebirth as the fruit of successful cerebral individuation. The brain that has completed the journey from forced isolation to chosen isolation has developed the neuroplastic capacity to be sufficient cognitive companionship for itself. This is not neural narcissism. It is psychological maturity translated into integrated brain architecture. When a brain that has experienced profound isolation returns to social interaction, it doesn't return with the same neural architecture that left. Research shows that significant periods of solitude can permanently alter our capacity for social connection, sometimes developing greater empathic depth, sometimes creating difficulties in reintegrating with superficial interactions. Clarice knew that her characters emerging from solitude carried an invisible neural imprint, a distinct quality of cognitive presence. They possessed a depth that sometimes intimidated others, a capacity for silence that disturbed those accustomed to the constant noise of superficial socialization. Richard Davidson discovered that brains that have undergone prolonged retreats maintain permanent changes in the neural networks linked to attention and compassion. They develop deeper listening skills and more intense presence, but may also struggle with meaningless social conversations. Brené Brown would recognize that these individuals often develop a unique capacity for authentic vulnerability, but they can also become neurologically intolerant of social superficiality. They carry the neural imprint of loneliness as a sacred scar that simultaneously makes them more compassionate and more selective in their connections. If you recognize aspects of this neural transformation in yourself, subscribe to the channel to continue exploring how solitude can be a tool for the evolution of consciousness. Pause for a moment and observe what happens in your mind when you imagine being completely alone for a whole week without any social contact. Do you feel a pang of anxiety, a sense of anticipated emptiness, or perhaps a mysterious curiosity, a secret relief at the possibility of finally finding genuine mental silence? Both reactions reveal important aspects of your brain's current neural architecture. Yalom discovered that the fear of isolation is not just social, but ontological. It is the neural terror of confronting our fundamental condition as isolated beings in our own consciousness. But for brains that have learned to navigate this existential solitude, it becomes a source of discovery, not despair. Now try this. Close your eyes for 30 seconds and try to remember the last time you were truly alone with your thoughts, without a phone, without music, without any external stimuli. Can you remember? Most contemporary brains have never experienced true neural silence. They live in constant stimulation that prevents access to deeper layers of cognitive processing. Viktor Frankl would remind us that brains that find inner meaning radiate a neural quality that others perceive without being able to name. It's not manufactured charisma. It's the neurological presence of someone who has developed the capacity for self-regulation independent of constant external validation. If you're curious about these hidden neural possibilities, comment below. I explore my neural architecture and activate the bell to continue discovering the mysteries of the brain in solitude. Now notice how all these neurological discoveries connect in a unique pattern. The brain deprived of social contact is not simply a deficient brain. It is a brain that has been forced to develop capabilities normally dormant. The neural reorganization of solitude, the development of deeper internal connections, the creativity that emerges from necessity, the rebirth of a self-regulated consciousness. Irvin Yalom would recognize that existential isolation, the fundamental loneliness of being a separate consciousness, paradoxically diminishes when the brain stops resisting this condition and begins to consciously explore it. Brains that accept their basic architecture of isolation develop extraordinary capacities for authentic connection. Albert Camus would see this neural journey as a form of cerebral revolt against the absurdity of constant social existence, the courageous decision to develop independent consciousness in a universe that offers endless stimulation but little genuine meaning. Clarice understood that these moments of profound neural solitude cannot be forced or manufactured. They emerge naturally when the brain stops resisting its own fundamentally solitary nature and begins to explore the vast dimensions of consciousness that only reveal themselves in absolute silence. We've reached the most extraordinary discovery about the brain without social contact. It doesn't become less human, but more essentially human. The sacred neuroplasticity that Richard Davidson documents isn't pathology, It's the accelerated evolution of neural capacities that remain dormant during constant social life. The isolated brain uncovers layers of consciousness and creativity that only emerge when you stop being what others expect you to be and begin to explore who you truly are. Clarice knew that her characters in Solitude weren't losing their humanity. They were discovering dimensions of humanity inaccessible in the constant noise of mandatory socialization. Jung's cerebral individuation reveals itself not as an abstract psychological process, but as concrete neural reorganization. The isolated brain can complete integration processes impossible in constant social distraction, developing internal coherence that becomes the basis for more authentic and less dependent relationships. Sartre's neural freedom manifests when a brain learns to function independently of constant external validation. It develops a unique capacity for conscious choice, less influenced by social pressures, and more capable of autonomous decisions based on deep internal processing. And here's the final paradox. Brains that have experienced significant isolation often develop a greater capacity for genuine intimacy, having neurally learned the difference between authentic connection and a neurotic need for social approval. They have transformed loneliness from a wound into a tool of human evolution. If you've reached this point, your brain has already begun to process neural possibilities that you may never have consciously considered. The invitation is not to compulsively isolate yourself, but to understand that your brain has dimensions of functioning that only reveal themselves in genuine silence, away from the constant noise of social stimulation. In conscious solitude, what you hear is not the empty echo of yourself, but the deep, complex voice of who you truly are when all neural masks are removed. The isolated brain is not a diminished brain. It is a brain that has discovered dimensions of itself impossible to access in the constant noise of obligatory social life. The next time you find yourself alone, truly alone, without devices, without distractions, instead of immediately fleeing for external stimulation, try remaining in this neural silence for a few minutes. Observe what thoughts emerge, what quality of consciousness reveals itself, what capacities of your brain begin to activate in the absence of social input. Loneliness, when navigated consciously, can be the most radical teacher about our true neural nature, not as punishment or pathology, but as a laboratory where your brain can finally explore its most extraordinary capabilities without constant external interference. If this content revealed possibilities about your brain that you had never considered, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Comment, "My consciousness is my laboratory," to declare your willingness to explore the hidden neural dimensions that only reveal themselves in the deep silence of conscious solitude. Remember, your brain doesn't need constant social stimulation to function fully. In fact, some of its most extraordinary capabilities only emerge when it can finally process reality without the constant filter of external expectations and validation. Solitude can be your most direct gateway to discovering who you truly are when no one else is looking.